They say the people who throw you away tell you everything about themselves. The real information is in what they assumed you would become without them. My name is Roland Eugene Marsh, and I was 17 years old the night my stepfather set 2 garbage bags of my clothes on the front porch of the house on Calloway Street in Decatur, Georgia, told me I had until morning to be gone, and said I was the single largest drain this family had ever known. The porch light was a bare yellow bulb that buzzed against the moths. The concrete step was cold through my jeans. The oak tree at the curb had a split in the trunk from a storm the previous summer that no one had ever gotten around to fixing. He had no idea what I was going to do with the next 28 years. Welcome back to Channel, where quiet choices make the loudest statements. If you've ever been told you were nothing by the people who were supposed to build you up, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. My full name is Roland Eugene Marsh. I was 45 years old when the events I am about to describe concluded, and by that point I had spent 19 years operating a private commercial real estate acquisition firm called Marsh Capital Group, incorporated in the state of Georgia, with offices on the 8th floor of a building on Peachtree Center Avenue in Atlanta. We did not advertise. We acquired office parks, strip centers, light industrial facilities, multi-tenant residential buildings in transitional neighborhoods. We were methodical and we were patient, and we had been profitable every year since our 3rd year of operation. My mother was Carol Marsh, née Pierson. She had married my stepfather, Dennis Calloway, in 1989 when I was 11 years old. Dennis had 2 children from his first marriage, a son named Gary, who was 14, and a daughter named Brenda, who was 12. They lived in a 4-bedroom house on Calloway Street in the Belvedere Park neighborhood of Decatur, Georgia, a house that Dennis had purchased in 1986 and considered the center of everything that mattered to him. The street was named for Dennis's grandfather, a fact Dennis mentioned often enough that it stopped meaning anything by the time I arrived. I was my mother's only child from her first marriage. My biological father had left when I was 4. My mother never spoke about him in specific terms. She spoke about him in the way people speak about weather systems that have already passed, as something that had happened, with residual damage. That was no longer the point. Dennis Calloway was not a cruel man in the theatrical sense. He was a man who had decided, in some private and complete way, that I was not his and therefore was not fully real. He provided food and a room. He did not provide much else. He called me Roland when he needed to call me something, and he called me nothing when he didn't. By the time I was 16, he had developed a habit of referring to my presence in the house in terms of cost: the food bill, the utility bill, the extra load on the washing machine. He made these calculations at the dinner table with the matter-of-fact tone of someone doing legitimate arithmetic. Gary and Brenda participated in this the way younger siblings participate in anything established by the dominant figure in a household, by absorbing it and eventually performing it themselves. By the time I was 17, Gary called me a freeloader with the fluency of someone who had been saying a word long enough that he no longer hears it. The house on Calloway Street had dark wood paneling in the den that smelled of cigarette smoke, and the carpet cleaner Dennis applied every spring. The kitchen had a yellow and white linoleum floor that was always slightly sticky near the stove. The backyard backed up to a chain-link fence that separated the property from the alley, and there was a dogwood tree in the corner that bloomed every March regardless of everything else going on in that house. My mother did not disagree with Dennis in any sustained way. This is not a judgment. She was a woman managing something I could not fully see from where I stood, and I have had 28 years to arrive at something that is not quite forgiveness, and is not quite not forgiveness, but is at minimum a form of understanding that she was carrying more than she could hold. The night Dennis put my bags on the porch, my mother was standing at the kitchen window. The light was on inside, and she was a silhouette. She did not come out. I was 17. I had $43 in my wallet, and a duffel bag with a change of clothes and my school ID. I walked to the end of Calloway Street and stood at the corner under the street lamp and looked back at the house for a long time, and then I turned and did not look back again. I stayed with my school friend Marcus Webb for 6 weeks, sleeping on a couch in his mother's apartment on Glenwood Avenue in East Atlanta. Marcus's mother, a woman named Ruth Webb, fed me dinner every night without comment and asked me once, quietly, on a Saturday morning when Marcus was still asleep, whether I was going to be all right. I told her I thought so. She nodded and made eggs. Ruth Webb was the first person who had looked at me in a direct and uncomplicated way since the night I had left Calloway Street, and something in my chest loosened around that in a way that took years to identify. I finished high school at Towers High, commuting on 2 buses each morning. I graduated in June of 1996 with a 3.7 GPA. My mother sent a card. Dennis did not. I enrolled at Georgia State University in the fall of 1996 on a partial academic scholarship, and a Pell Grant that covered the remainder of my first-year tuition. I worked 22 hours a week at a copy shop on Decatur Street throughout my undergraduate years, opening the shop at 6 a.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and closing on Fridays at 10 p.m. for 3.5 years, and used those earnings to cover housing and food. I graduated in May of 2000 with a degree in finance. I had saved $9,000 for $100 by the time I graduated, not because I was exceptional, because I had learned at 17 that there was no floor under me except the one I built myself, and I had been building quietly ever since. The Savings Book, a small green-covered passbook from Citizens Community Bank on Edgewood Avenue, issued in my name on September 3rd, 1996, with every deposit recorded in ink in the teller's handwriting, sat in a fireproof box under my bed in the apartment I rented on Memorial Drive. I looked at it more than was strictly necessary. It was the most honest document I owned. My wife, Sandra Marsh, née Coleman, had died on April 4th, 2017, of a glioblastoma diagnosed 14 months earlier. She was 43 years old. We had been married for 16 years. She had been the office manager and de facto chief operating officer of Marsh Capital Group from its first year of operation, and she had understood the business the way you understand something you have built with your own hands at a table while the coffee gets cold. After she died, I ran the firm alone for 2 years before hiring an operations director. The desk she had used was still in the corner office. I did not move it. In the spring of 1998, while I was still in school, I had driven past Calloway Street for the first time since leaving. I did not stop. The house looked the same. The dogwood in the backyard was just visible over the fence. The oak at the curb still had the split in the trunk. I did not stop again for another 26 years. The first named professional I worked with in any significant capacity was Howard Lim, a commercial real estate attorney at the firm of Lim and Castellano on Spring Street in Atlanta, who reviewed my first acquisition agreement, a light industrial unit in the East Point neighborhood, on March 14, 2006, at 10 a.m. and filed the closing documents with Fulton County on March 22, 2006. At 2:30 p.m., Howard had a habit of reading every clause aloud before signing anything. I found this useful. I kept him for 18 years. I paid the rent on Marcus Webb's mother's apartment on Glenwood Avenue every month from January 2008 until Ruth Webb's death in March of 2014, because she had asked me once whether I was going to be all right, and that had been enough. 6 years and 2 months of rent every month, deposited without announcement into a money order addressed to the building manager. Marcus found out after his mother died, going through her receipts. He called me. I said it was nothing. He said it wasn't nothing. We did not argue about it. My throat tightened when Marcus said that. Just once, and then it cleared. In the fall of 2014, my half-brother Gary Calloway called me for the first time since I had left Calloway Street in 1995. He had found my number through a mutual acquaintance from Towers High. He called on a Thursday evening at 6:47 p.m. I was at my desk on the 8th floor of the Peachtree Center Avenue building, reviewing a lease renewal document for a property in the Vine City neighborhood. The office smelled the coffee I had made at 3 o'clock and the dry, warm air that the building's heating system pushed through the vents in October. He said, "Roland, it's Gary Calloway." I said, "I know who you are, Gary." He said he was calling because Dennis had passed away in August. He said the house on Calloway Street had gone to my mother and that the estate was still being sorted. He said he thought I should know. I said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, "You're not going to ask about the estate?" I said, "No." There was a pause. He said, "Well, you never were part of the family anyway." I said nothing. I looked at the lease renewal on my desk. My hands were flat on the surface, and I did not move them. He said, "No offense." I said, "None taken, Gary." I set the phone down at 6:54 p.m. and looked at the window, which at that hour showed mostly the reflection of the office rather than the city below it. I could see my own face in the glass. I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked the lease renewal back up and finished reading it. That was October 2014. By December, Gary had called 2 more times. The calls had a pattern. They were checking something. I was not sure what, and I did not ask. In January of 2015, my mother called me for the first time in 11 years. Her voice was thinner than I remembered, and she spoke carefully, in the way of someone who has prepared what they want to say, but is not entirely confident in the preparation. The evening light on the 8th floor came in horizontal through the west-facing windows in January, amber and long, and the building across the street had its lights on in every window. She said, "Roland, I know I don't have any right to call." I said, "You can call, Mom." She said she had been thinking about things. She said she was sorry for the night on the porch. She said it had not been right, and she had known it was not right, and she had not been able to do anything about it, and she was sorry. Something in me went very still. Not cold, not flat, still in a way that deep water is still. Not because nothing is in it, but because everything in it has settled to the bottom and stopped moving. I said, "I know." She said, "I wanted to ask if you would come to the house sometime, just to come." I said I would think about it. My stomach had not dropped. My hands had not shaken. I set the phone down at 7:31 p.m. and sat with the amber light on the desk for a while and did not do anything else. By spring of 2015, Gary and Brenda had established a more direct line of inquiry. Gary called in March and asked whether I had any interest in the property on Calloway Street. Now that Dennis was gone and my mother was there alone, he said the neighborhood had changed and the house needed work, and it might make sense to the family to look at options. The wood of my desk was cool under my palms. The coffee machine across the office was quiet. The street below was wet from an earlier rain. I said, "What kind of options?" He said, "Well, if you're doing as well as people say, maybe you'd want to put some money in, help Mom out, keeping the family." I said, "I'll think about it." He said, "You want to think about it soon. Real estate's moving in Decatur." I nodded once. I said, "I'll be in touch." He said, "Don't wait too long. Family matters." I set the phone down at 10:17 a.m. and looked at the ceiling for a long moment and thought about the word family and what it had meant on Calloway Street in 1995 and what Gary was hoping it would mean now. In April of 2015, Brenda called. Her approach was warmer than Gary's, with the specific warmth of someone who has been assigned the soft cell. She said it had been too long. She said family was important, especially after loss. She said their mother was struggling alone in that house, and it would mean so much if Roland could find a way to be involved. The afternoon light in the conference room where I took the call was diffuse, filtered through the interior blinds. The room smelled of the whiteboard markers from the morning's meeting. A half-eaten box of crackers sat on the sideboard from the same meeting, and I had meant to throw it away and had not gotten to it. I said, "How much is a house worth, Brenda?" She paused. She said, "That's not really the point, Roland." I said, "What is the point?" She said, "The point is that your family and family pulls together." I said, "I'll look into it." She said, "Don't make this complicated. It doesn't need to be complicated." I said nothing. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "I'll be in touch." I filed the call in my memory under the category of things that have a shape I recognize, and I did not call back that week or the week after. By the summer of 2015, my mother had called twice more. Her calls were different from Gary's and Brenda's. She did not ask for money. She asked whether I was eating properly. She asked whether I was sleeping. She told me once that the dogwood in the backyard had bloomed that March the same as always, as if it didn't know anything had changed. I said that sounded right. She laughed a little. It was the first time I had heard her laugh since before Dennis. My throat tightened once during that call, briefly, and then cleared. In September of 2015, Gary called with a specific number. He said the house needed a new roof. The HVAC was original to the 1980s. And the foundation had a hairline crack that a contractor had assessed at $12,000 to repair. He said the combined cost of deferred maintenance was somewhere around $60,000 and that he and Brenda didn't have it, and their mother certainly didn't, and he was wondering whether Roland, given his situation, might want to step up. I said, "What does step up mean?" He said, "It means contribute, be a part of this family for once." I said nothing. Something in my chest went flat and quiet and stayed that way. He said, "You owe this family something, Roland, whether you want to admit it or not." I said, "I'll think about it, Gary." I set the phone down at 4:33 p.m. on September 17, 2015. I looked at the street below the office for a long time. The leaves on the trees along Peachtree Center Avenue were just beginning to turn at the edges. My hands were very still on the desk. I had been thinking about Calloway Street for 20 years. Not obsessively, not destructively, in the way you think about a place that was the last place before everything changed, with a particular attention of someone who knows that a specific geography altered the course of a life and want to understand exactly how. I had looked up the property records for the Calloway street block on 3 separate occasions over the years, not with any plan, just to know. The houses on that street were modest single-family homes, most built in the 1950s and 1960s, on lots of approximately 6,000 square feet. The neighborhood had been stable and slightly declining through the 1990s and early 2000s, and had begun a slow appreciating trend around 2010 as Atlanta's in-town neighborhoods expanded their radius of desirability. I had looked at those records. I had noted them. I had filed them in the same careful place. I filed everything. I called Howard Lim the morning after Gary's September call. It was September 18, 2015 at 8:45 a.m. I told Howard I wanted a full ownership report on every residential property on Calloway Street in Decatur, Georgia. He said he would have it to me within a week. He had it to me in 4 days. There were 14 properties on the block. 7 were owner-occupied. 3 were already rental properties with absentee owners. 4, including the house at the end of the block owned by Dennis Calloway's estate, now in my mother's name, had changed hands within the last decade. I read that report 3 times. I made notes on a yellow legal pad. I put the legal pad in the top drawer of my desk. Then I waited. It was a Tuesday morning in February of 2016 at 7:08 a.m. when I sat down at the kitchen table in my apartment on Ponce de Leon Avenue in Atlanta and made the decision that I had technically been making for 21 years without fully naming it. The kitchen faced north, and the light at that hour was gray and flat, and came through the window above the sink without warmth. The coffee was fresh. The legal pad from the top drawer of my office desk was on the table in front of me. I had brought it home the night before without deciding to. I was 45 years old. My wife had been dead for not quite a year. The apartment was quiet in the particular way that apartments are quiet when they've been built for 2 people and are occupied by 1. I sat with the legal pad and the gray light and the fresh coffee, and I thought about 17. I thought about the $43 in my wallet on the night I left. I thought about the concrete step and the bare yellow bulb and the moth against the glass. I thought about Ruth Webb's eggs on a Saturday morning, and the 2 buses to Towers High, and the copy shop on Decatur Street at 6 o'clock in the morning when the city was not yet awake. I thought about the savings book from Citizens Community Bank with the teller's handwriting recording every deposit in ink, and the $9,400 I had graduated with, and the 19 years since then of acquiring things that other people had not seen the value in yet. I thought about Gary saying you owe this family something. I thought about what I owed and to whom, and whether those 2 things were the same question, or different questions that had been conflated for a very long time by people who found conflation convenient. I thought about my mother standing at the kitchen window, the silhouette, the light on inside. My eyes stung once, looking at the legal pad, just once. Then I picked up the pen. The plan was not complicated. It did not need to be complicated. The Calloway street block had 14 properties. The ones already in rental hands were acquirable through standard commercial channels. The owner-occupied ones will require patient cultivation and fair market offers. No pressure, no urgency, nothing that could be characterized as predatory. This was not predation. This was acquisition, which I had been doing for 19 years, and which I knew how to do correctly. The house my mother lived in would not be acquired. That was the first and last decision, and it was not a difficult one. Whatever happened on Calloway Street, my mother's house was not a transaction. Everything else was. I called Howard Lim at 8:15 a.m. from the kitchen table. I told him I wanted to begin a quiet assessment of acquisition viability for the residential properties on Calloway Street in Decatur, excluding the property currently occupied by Carol Marsh at number 14. Howard said he would begin the ownership and lien research that week. He said he would be discreet. I said I knew he would. I continued to run the firm through the first quarter of 2016 with the same operational cadence as always. On February 24th, 2016 at 9 a.m., I met with our asset manager, a woman named Diane Cho at our Peachtree Center Avenue office, to review the Q4 2015 performance report for the existing portfolio. Diane noted that occupancy across our light industrial holdings was at 94%, the highest it had been since 2011. I told her the team had done good work. I meant it. On March 3rd, 2016, at 2 p.m., I reviewed Howard Lim's initial ownership report for the Calloway Street block. 3 of the 7 non-maternal properties had liens or encumbrances that suggested the owners might be open to liquidity. 2 were in estates being administered by out-of-state heirs. 1 had been listed for sale privately without an agent 6 months earlier before being withdrawn. My hands were steady on the report. My chest was level. I made notes on the legal pad. This was going to take time. That was fine. I had been patient for 21 years. A few more would not change anything essential. Gary Calloway called me in April of 2016 with a new number, $80,000. The house needed more work than they had initially assessed. The foundation repair estimate had risen. The electrical panel was original and needed replacement. He said their mother was not in a position to manage any of this, and that he and Brenda had done the math, and Roland was the only one with the resources to make it right. The morning light on my desk was early spring light, sharper than February, coming through the east-facing windows and landing on the surface at an angle that caught the grain of the wood. I said, "I appreciate you keeping me informed, Gary." He said, "This isn't a courtesy call. We need an answer." I said, "I understand." He said, "Do you? Because it seems like you've been thinking about it for a long time without doing anything." I said nothing. He said, "You could fix this tomorrow if you wanted to. You just don't want to." I said, "I'll be in touch." He said, "Family doesn't wait forever, Roland." I set the phone down. My breath came in slowly and went out slowly. I picked up the property report on my desk and returned to the page I had been reading. By the fall of 2016, Howard Lim had identified 4 acquisition targets on the Calloway Street block that were viable within the next 12 to 18 months. 2 were estate properties with cooperative administrators. 1 was an elderly owner who had approached a local agent privately about selling. 1 was a rental property whose absentee owner had not responded to tenant maintenance requests in 8 months and whose rental income had consequently been withheld by the tenant under Georgia's repair and deduct statute. Howard filed the initial letter of interest on the first estate property on October 6, 2016, at 11 a.m. The estate administrator, a woman named Patricia Nguyen, who was the deceased owner's daughter, responded within 2 weeks. We closed on that property on January 9th, 2017 at 3:15 p.m. The purchase price was $112,000. Fair market. No pressure. I did not tell Gary. I did not tell Brenda. I did not tell anyone on Calloway Street. My mother called in November of 2016. She said the house felt large for one person. She said the dogwood in the backyard had lost its leaves and the yard looked bare. I said that was how November looked. She laughed a little. I said I would come by in the spring to look at the foundation crack. She said that would be nice. She said she had not expected me to offer that. I said, "I know." My throat tightened once when I hung up. I let it. By March of 2017, Marsh Capital Group had acquired 3 properties on the Calloway Street block. 12 and 16 were the estate properties. 22 was the elderly owner's sale, which Howard had handled with a particular delicacy the situation required. Face-to-face meetings, full market value. 30 days to vacate at the seller's pace, not ours. The seller, a retired postal worker named Arthur Simmons, had lived at number 22 for 31 years. He shook my hand at closing on March 28, 2017, at 10 a.m. and said he was glad the place was in someone who seemed to know what he was doing. I said I hoped to take good care of it. Sandra died 8 days later. I did not work for 6 weeks after the funeral. Diane Cho managed the firm. Howard held the open negotiations in suspension at my request. I sat in the apartment on Ponce de Leon Avenue, and I did not work. Then I went back. By June of 2018, we had acquired 6 of the 13 non-maternal properties on the block. The 7th and 8th were in active negotiation. The remaining 5 were not yet available, and I was not in a hurry. In August of 2018, Gary called again. His tone had shifted. There was something in it that was no longer quite confident, though I could not have said what had changed for him. He said he'd been hearing things. He said someone in the neighborhood had mentioned that properties were changing hands, and he wanted to know what Roland knew about it. I said, "People buy and sell, Gary." He said, "On Calloway Street?" I said, "All over." He said, "You wouldn't know anything about that." I said, "I'll let you know if I hear anything." My hands were flat on the desk. The office was quiet. Diane had gone home an hour earlier. The city below the 8th-floor windows was moving in the early evening way that cities move, not urgently, just continuously. I set the phone down at 7:22 p.m. By November of 2023, after 7 years of patient, methodical, fair market acquisition, during which I had introduced myself to every seller personally, offered full and fair compensation, and converted every acquired property to well-managed rental units with a local property management firm called Hendricks & Associates on Commerce Drive in Decatur. Marsh Capital Group owned 11 of the 13 non-maternal properties on the Calloway Street block. The certified letters went out on a Monday morning in February of 2024, sent from Howard Lim's office at 9 a.m. to the mailing address of record for every property on the block. Each letter was addressed to the owner of record. My mother's property received no letter. The letter stated in plain language that Marsh Capital Group was the owner of record for 11 properties on Calloway Street in Decatur, Georgia, and that as a majority property holder on the block, we wish to introduce ourselves and discuss the long-term management plan for the street. Gary's rental address was number 7 Calloway Street. He had been renting there for 4 years from the previous owner and had continued renting from Marsh Capital Group since our acquisition of number 7 in March of 2021. Though the management had been handled entirely through Hendricks & Associates, and Gary had never connected the ownership name to the name of a person he had grown up dismissing. The letter reached him on a Wednesday. He called me at 4:47 p.m. Something in my chest was very steady, not triumphant, not elevated, steady in the way of a thing that has been true for a long time and is now simply visible. Gary's voice, when I picked up, was different from every version of it I had heard since 2014. He said, "Roland." I said, "Gary." He said, "Is this a joke?" I said, "No." He said, "Marsh Capital Group." I said, "Yes." He said, "You own the street." I said nothing. His breath came through the phone. I heard it. He was standing somewhere quiet. I could tell by the absence of background noise, and his breath came in and went out twice before he said anything else. He said, "You've been buying up this street." I said, 11 properties over 7 years, all fair market acquisitions, all managed through a licensed property management firm, all tenants in good standing. He said, "I'm a tenant." I said, "You are." He said, "What does this mean?" I said, "It means your lease continues under the same terms, managed through Hendricks & Associates, as it has been for 3 years. Nothing changes for the tenants." He said, "Nothing changes." I said, "That's right." There was a long silence. I let it be long. I looked at my desk, the grain of the wood, the coffee cup, the legal pad. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I could." He said, "That's not an answer." I said, "No, it isn't." I heard him exhale. His voice, when it came back, was quieter than I had heard it in 30 years. He said, "You were 17. I said, "I was." He said, "And you just." I said, "I went to work." His face was not visible to me, but his voice had gone to a place that I recognized. the place a voice goes when a person runs out of a version of the story they've been telling themselves and has to look at the actual one. I said, "Your lease is secure, Gary. Your rent won't increase above the legally permitted annual adjustment. Hendricks will handle all maintenance requests. You'll find their number in the letter." He said nothing. I said, "Take care of yourself." I set the phone down at 5:03 p.m. on a Wednesday in February of 2024. I sat for a moment with my hands flat on the desk, and the city moving below the 8-floor windows in the ordinary way it always moved. Then I stood up. I put on my coat. I took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out onto Peachtree Center Avenue and got in my car and drove home. The radio was off. The streets in Atlanta in February were bare and straight, and the lights came on ahead of me in sequence as the evening arrived. I drove home the long way, past Decatur, past the Glenwood Avenue exit, past the neighborhood where Ruth Webb's apartment building still stood. I did not stop. I just drove past it and kept going. Brenda called the following Monday at 10 a.m. Her voice was careful and somewhat formal in the way of someone who has rehearsed. She said she wanted to understand the situation better. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. She said family was complicated, and she wanted Roland to know that she had always thought him as a brother, whatever the circumstances. I said, "I know, Brenda." She said, "What happens now?" I said, "The properties are managed through Hendricks & Associates. If you or Gary have any questions about your leases, they're the right contact." She said, "In the house?" "Mom's house." I said, "Your mother's house is her house. That has never been part of any transaction, and it never will be." She said, "Oh." I said, "Yes." She said, "She knows?" I said, "I called her last week." The call with my mother had been on a Thursday evening. I had told her what I had done and why I had left her house out of it, and that nothing would change for her. She had been quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Roland, you didn't have to do that." I said I knew. She said, "Your father's name is on that street sign." I said I knew that too. She said, "It doesn't mean what he thought it meant." I said, "No, it doesn't." She asked me to come to the house in the spring to look at the foundation crack. I said I would bring someone who knew what to look at. She said that would be good. My throat tightened once during that call. My eyes stung briefly. Then both cleared, and we talked for another 40 minutes about ordinary things. And that was what it was. By June of 2024, Marsh Capital Group had acquired the 12th and final non-maternal property on Calloway Street. Howard Lim filed the closing documents with DeKalb County on June 18, 2024, at 11:30 a.m. The purchase price was $147,000. The seller was an investment group from out of state that had been looking for an exit for 2 years. We gave them one. I visited the house on Calloway Street in April of 2024. My mother made coffee. The kitchen still had the yellow and white linoleum floor, though it had been replaced once in the intervening years. The dogwood in the backyard was in bloom. I looked at the foundation crack, which had not worsened, and I called a structural engineer named Dennis Okafor at Okafor Civil Group on Wesley Chapel Road, who came out on April 11, 2024, at 9 a.m. and assessed the crack as cosmetic rather than structural. He filed a written report that afternoon. The repair cost was $400. My mother poured more coffee while I read the report. The kitchen was warm, and the dogwood was visible through the back window. The oak at the curb had been removed since I left. A storm in 2009, my mother said, and the sidewalk where the roots had lifted was smoothed and repaired. Roland Eugene Marsh, 45 years old, and back on Calloway Street for reasons no one on that street had anticipated. A man who is told he is nothing at 17 has two options. He can spend the rest of his life proving the statement wrong to the people who made it, or he can spend the rest of his life building something true and let the statement speak for itself when it runs out of room. The dogwood bloomed every March. It had never needed anyone's permission. If you were sitting at a desk in Atlanta on a Wednesday afternoon in February of 2024 when Gary Calloway called and heard his voice go to that place, what would you have said in the silence before you answered? Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.